This is Law Bites, a podcast with Michael Geist.
We are at a crossroad for the telecom sector in Canada. Today, we have a unique opportunity, and I would say even an historic opportunity, to see a real fourth national player emerge, and most importantly, compete in a way that will drive down prices for Canadians.
That was ISP Minister François Champagne late last week, announcing that he was effectively giving the go-ahead to the Rogers-Shaw merger by approving license transfers to Videotron as part of the deal. Champagne tried to spin the move as a win for Canadians, arguing that somehow fewer competitors would lead to greater competition. But in recent months, the Canadian communications landscape has shifted, not only with this merger, but also with the gradual disappearance of about a half dozen independent providers who've been swallowed up by the large companies. What does all of this mean for wireless and internet competition in Canada? Is there any hope for consumers for a respite from some of the world's highest prices? Paul Andersen is the chair of CNOC, the Competitive Network Operators of Canada, and the president of eGate Networks, an independent provider. He joins me on the podcast to talk about the implications of the Rogers-Shaw merger, the loss of many independent providers, and recent leadership changes at the CRTC. Paul, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad that you've jumped on. You know, the plan was to talk about what's been happening in the independent ISP and telecom sector in Canada and some of the recent announcements from the CRTC. But as we record this on a Friday afternoon, we've been overtaken by the news. You know, just several hours ago, the ISP Minister François Champagne granted his approval to the Rogers-Shaw merger. Wasn't much of a surprise, but obviously it's a pretty important development. So why don't we just start off right away with your thoughts on that process and his decision?
It was inevitable what the outcome was, that there would be an approval of this transaction in some form, at least from an industry standpoint. I think the real mystery was going to be on what conditions the minister would put on that. And it was very clear for some time that revolved around what was going to happen with Freedom Mobile. And for those who maybe don't track, Freedom Mobile, which originally was Win Mobile, was Shaw's wireless offering. And there was obviously concern on the original deal that if Rogers and Shaw merged, you would see that upstart wireless provider that many Canadians rely on disappear. And there had been many rumors or theories about where that was going to go. It had come up in many of the processes, and certainly it would seem clear that it would end up with Videotron. The minister seemed to really be pushing that was the correct outcome for that. And, you know, it was important to understand why that struggle was occurring. Because certainly governments going back, you know, as far as 2010 or even longer, have really tried to bring Canadians lower prices. Anybody who's traveled, you know, regardless of what the incumbents say, know that wireless prices seem very high compared to anywhere else. Anyone who's traveled knows you can pick up a plan sometimes for half the price that we pay in an airport without any negotiation. So the minister was really, really clearly trying to make sure that this fourth national player would A, happen, and B, would be strong. And I think that's what we saw. We saw that you know, he has received contractual, as he said it, assurances. He mentioned that his background knew that these would be enforceable and that there will be penalties, and that he believes that these conditions that he's put in this will give Videotron access to a strong network that they can build on. I think one of the concerning things that certainly as a member of a certain organization that represents service-based competitors is there's a lot of, you know, some might even say sweetheart deals that Rogers has been required to offer Videotron, both in the wireless and the wireline space here. And I think there is a bit of a missed opportunity that why wasn't that just something that's offered to all competitors? Because I think that would have benefited Canadians, especially since at the end of the day, with the deal approved, Canada has one less competitor. It's and combined with some other market consolidation, and there's no way that one less competitor is good for Canadians and low prices.
Yeah, no, thanks. I'm inclined to agree. I've been asked a lot today about this merger, and I mean, to me, one of the takeaways is you don't create more competition by having fewer competitors. At least it certainly doesn't feel that way. And the removal, not just, or the diminishment of not just this competitor alongside a whole series of other competitors in recent months, I think really speaks to that. The Bureau, obviously, the Competition Bureau opposed the merger. Tribunal didn't back that decision. And now the minister says that he's built in some safeguards in terms of contracts that he was waving around during the press conference. Say this is a contract with Canadians, and various safeguards and requirements on the part of both Videotron and Rogers. I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at those contracts yet, but do you think that some of the provisions, some of the things that he has in mind are sufficient? What do you think some of the likely implications are for competition and for consumer pricing?
I did read them very quickly, but I think there still needs to be quite a bit absorbed. I did notice that a lot of the commitments were ones that had been previously made, so at least they are now tied to these penalties that the ministers point out. But it does seem like it. I think there is obviously some concern here and missed opportunities. For instance, one of the items that came out of the deal was that Videotron will have access to Rogers both wireline and wireless facilities. There's a deal that Rogers will supply that, and it would have been, I think, good for the minister to make that available to all competitors. Now there's a special deal that allows Videotron to grow at its network, but not other competitors. So why does Videotron get access to that? And I think there's also still a failed opportunity to allow mobile virtual network operators. And for those they're not familiar, that's the idea again, that as opposed to building the actual tower network, you buy access to a wireless provider. And this is something we've seen in almost every other country but Canada. I'm sure many people have seen Ryan Reynolds ads for Mint Mobile in the US, which was a very popular MVNO that actually recently got acquired. But that's just something that's never been created here in Canada. And while this does seem to be something that will tie Videotron and Rogers, but it doesn't seem to be doing much to encourage more competitors to enter the market. And as you mentioned, we've seen quite a few disappear in recent times.
Yeah, I want to come specifically to that in just a moment. Why don't we go back to what I thought would be our regularly scheduled programming? You're the chair of CNOC, and I want to get into yours and CNOC's perspective on some of these recent developments, particularly with respect to some of those independent players. But first, can you describe the organization and talk a little bit whether or not, or to what extent you got involved both in the merger related issues with Shaw and Rogers and some of the other proceedings and hearings that were taking place around competition in the communication space?
Sure. CNOC is a not-for-profit trade association, and its acronym stands for the Competitive Network Operators of Canada. And CNOC is the voice of competitive internet and telecommunication service providers that operate based on service-based competition. And service-based competition is where part of the services we offer sometimes is where we lease facilities from companies such as the incumbents, such as Bell and Rogers and Telus. It's always important to understand that it's a portion of our networks. Many of our members operate large-scale technical operations and nationwide networks, along with a variety of other services. But that tends to be our core membership value, which is that we believe that consumers are served by competitive options where some of the options we offer is better customer service, lower prices, or other innovations. And we formed around 2011, and the timing of that is not totally random. That was the date of, for those that have been following the sector quite a while, was when there was what was called the usage-based billing, or UBB debate, where Bell suggested that our members should be charged usage-based charges that we would then have to pass on consumers, effectively attempting to kill, at the time, what was one offering that you could only get from an independent member, which was unlimited internet. As you remember, the incumbents at that time, almost all their plans had some kind of usage limit with then potentially large overages charges. They've mostly all moved away from those plans and since, but that was our beginnings, and ever since that we've been fighting the cause of the service-based competitor. In terms of the merger and approval process, so I think the first thing, just as a general, is we're not opposed to acquisitions in general. It's natural for such transactions to occur and can be a positive sign of health in the industry. Our just concern is just when we don't have market or regulatory conditions that allow for the new entrants. We want to make sure that there are new players entering the space that can be lost as you see these mergers occur. In terms of Roger Shaw, we did appear at the Indu committee, and we noted a few things. The original deal certainly did not benefit Canadians. If it had proceeded, it would have only benefited Rogers and Shaw, and would have, of course, also benefited Bell and Telus, since you would have seen the loss of Freedom Mobile as an independent, and at the time a very insurgent provider. It was certainly instigating a lot of competition in the market where it was able to operate. But we also stressed that the government really needs to look at mandating again these MVNOs I spoke of earlier. That it was time to allow competition to flourish, both making sure that Freedom Mobile continued to exist, but that you also had a regulated MVNO regime that would allow these names to have multiple choices for their wireless services. And obviously the government has chosen only to proceed with the former. And we just stressed that the market conditions that our members operated since 2015 have seen a lot of independent members struggle. We've been unable to gain meaningful access to fiber optic facilities. We've never been granted access to wireless, even though in 2019, I believe it was the CRTC even said that was something that should be granted to us, but then they 180'd. And they also, the CRTC 180'd on fees, and we stress that the rates by which our members are charged, these are set by the CRTC, and they had indicated that these were potentially too high, but then went through a multi-year battle where they ended up effectively remaining back where they always been. So that was effectively what we had told the various bodies about the Roger Shaw merger.
Okay. Interesting to hear, and certainly the trip back memory lane with UBP bring back a lot of memories. So you talked,
times.
It was, it was really the start of a lot of the net neutrality discussion in Canada.
And of course, it was net neutrality and the first regulatory by tweet, if I remember correctly.
You remember exactly. And it was, I think, chair at the time was Conrad von Finkenstein, who wasn't so happy about the minister at the time, who was Tony Clement, putting something out by tweet.
Yes,
times have certainly changed.
Times have certainly changed, but yes, that started the ball rolling down, which has been quite a ride. So
I think that's true. Now, one of the other rides and big changes that we've seen lately does involve that issue of mergers that you referenced a moment ago, and it's flown, I think, a little bit under the radar screen in recent months, but we've seen a large number of mergers, and I think better described really is almost a disappearance of many of the independent providers: Distributel, Oxio, eBox, Start, vMedia, Ultima, all scooped up in recent months. Your thoughts on where that leaves the independent market, and I'm curious, at least so far, how some of the larger players who have acquired these companies, these smaller independent players, how are they using those acquisitions? How are they using those companies?
Well, in terms of where it leaves the market, it obviously leaves it much smaller. Of the names you named, several of those were of the largest. And for reference, I think one of the late dates, the peak of the independent market was the independents at one point had 11% market share, according to CRTC data. And at least several of those members constituted a large bulk of that. So, from a market share perspective, we don't have exact data, because one of the problems is it's a pretty fast moving space. As you mentioned, there's been quite a few of these moving under the radar. So we're seeing a lessening of competition, a lessening of independent market share. In terms of where these large players, I think it's still very early to understand what the true long-term goals are here. And obviously, I'm not sure each acquirer has the same motives. One clue that's maybe interesting is that of all the names you mentioned, almost all of them were members of CNOC at one time, and they have remained members of CNOC. Their new owners have decided to allow them to stay in CNOC because almost all except for one of those, I believe, they're being operated independently. eBox was being folded in, but is now actually being folded under Distributel, according to some recent Bell press releases. But they're being operated still arm's length for now, and they continue to be so. Given that CNOC's mission is to still promote service-based competition, that hasn't changed. Their presence suggests that perhaps some of the incumbents that have fought against service-based competition in the past are now seeing this as a path forward in concert with their facilities-based approach. So on one hand, we welcome the validation of the model that CNOC has been supporting. And I'm speculating a bit, of course, but I suggest that these acquisitions are probably fueled a little bit about the topic we spoke earlier. Rogers Shaw creates now a national footprint, near national footprint with for Rogers, or certainly one of the larger ones. And I think you'll see that many of these incumbents are seeing that service-based competition will let them quickly extend outside of what they would consider to call their home turf. And we're also seeing it as another extension of flanker brands, which again, don't see a problem with flanker brands. Again, those are where we've seen very heavily in the wireless space where, someone like Bell will operate Lucky Mobile as an arm's length, they would say, competitor. We don't really see them as competitors because I don't think anybody is really seeing that Lucky Mobile is going to be competing with Bell itself. But they do see it as a way to better market their brands, and that's good. And we've seen that some of our members are an extension of that flanker brand strategy. So all in all, that it seems to be a new world in terms of what the traditional incumbent strategy will be from both just the territory they plan to serve and how they plan to serve it.
Yeah. Okay. So you may have touched on this next question a little bit, but I'll go ahead with it anyway. And it kind of begs the question of why, or even more, I suppose, why now? This big change in it. You've highlighted a bit, talking about you got one competitor creating a national footprint, and so in a sense that's a response. So that suggests that much of this may well be driven by consolidation that we've seen among some of the big players, Rogers Shaw, and perhaps even before that, Bell MTS. Is that, do you think, really the prime driver, or is the CRTC's decisions, and we're going to come to the CRTC in just a moment, but is the CRTC decisions a driver? In other words, is it the independents looking at what they've seen from the regulatory environment and saying, we need to look for an exit? Or do you think it's more a function of, Rogers made their move, we're seeing this consolidation, and so now we see responses from some of the other larger players?
Certainly, I think it's a bit of a perfect storm of a few things. I think that the market conditions, like I said, going back to the fact that rates that the costs that our members pay went through years of influx, and it caused a lot of concern because for instance the CRTC said that they were going to lower rates, but they were marked at what's called interim, which was just jargon that there was still proceedings to occur, but many of our members lowered their rates to be more competitive at that time while they waited for the final. But of course, the final decision, which came years later, ended up we're back where we started. And so it caused quite a bit of stress, especially on our smaller members, where it was just becoming harder and harder to compete because they, in our view, were overpaying for the services they were getting. And again, that small portion of the network that they were getting from the incumbents. And I think that drove a lot of these independent players to start taking calls from people who were interested in acquiring. And there's always been interest in our members, and our members were always getting calls. But there's something about the I think the poor regulatory conditions that just caused them to take the calls, which then combined with the Rogers Shaw thing, I think caused a bit of a spike in valuations. Many of these deals we don't know the exact deal, but there are some public filings that suggest that some of these acquisitions were over $1,000 per residential subscriber. And when you look at that and do some napkin math on what the margins were, and you're seeing multiple years of earnings ahead of you, combined with that regulatory bit, I think the decision became a no-brainer for many of these members, and they chose to exit.
Okay. I mean, that speaks to the business considerations those companies have. Of course, from a consumer perspective, Canadians are going to be less interested in those business considerations and more fundamentally about what it means for competition in the country. What's your take on ultimately what our competitive environment looks like, let's say right now, as compared to, I don't know, 3 years ago or 5 years ago before we started to see these kinds of changes?
Well, I think you have to roll back to what I said previously. You know, we had seen quite a climb in market share. You know, it was 11% and rising, and we saw many of the incumbents reacting at the regulatory level. And it's not been good because, you know, delay has been the name of the game. You know, we've been not been expecting meaningful access to fiber since 2015. You know, we've been expecting new rates since 2016. And that's a long time for these businesses to operate and find hard on their cash reserves, which, you know, it is important because if our members don't have certainty on their rates, it's hard for them to offer the competitive pricing that I think Canadians expect. And there's been a lot of, or they haven't been able to provide the same service. You know, I was just talking with someone last night who was using one of these acquired members and was heartbroken here because they said, oh, it's just, you know, I always got great service. They returned any query very quickly. They were on top of everything. No, we just don't see that anymore because, as we said earlier, every time you take a competitor out of the space, I don't think anyone would say that benefits Canadians. The problem is that until something changes in the regulatory space, we're going to see less and less competitors. There's not really a rush of competitors to come in to take the space of these because they don't see the opportunity. But it's also led to some other interesting kind of developments for those that watch the scene a bit carefully, in that because the incumbents have acquired a lot of these players, we aren't seeing quite the alignment that you might have seen before when there was regulatory proceedings in Canada. You know, you could kind of always guess that if there was an issue that was service-based competitors against the facilities base, all the facilities base would line up in one direction and the service base would line up in another. But we even just saw just last week where Videotron, for instance, who of course acquired V Media, took a contrary position in it was a very mundane process issue, but ended up being, from what the commission said, was a deciding factor to deny a delay to the incumbents in a proceeding. So, you know, I don't know how that unfolds, but it is interesting where we may not see such an alignment between all the incumbents in the time to come.
Okay, that is interesting. So things have been shaken up a little bit in the competitive environment from a regulatory process perspective. They've also been shaken up from the regulator. You know, in the last number of months, CRTC is under new leadership, and I think it's fair to say it's been sending some signals about its concern with competition and its desire to do something about it. How would you characterize the changes that we've seen since the start of the new year?
Certainly extremely positive from a service-based competitor, and I think for Canadians, the chairman of Treaties very quickly signaled that she was of the view that the model was not working, and that something would become forthwith. The concern always there is that as those that follow any government or regulatory policy, not always the fastest process, certainly doesn't move at the speed at sometimes the technology moves. So certainly for a chair that's only been in the seat 12 weeks to come so quickly with change was certainly refreshing. We've certainly had expressed our concern over the previous leadership there. So it's been very positive to see. And again, it's still very early. There's still a bit of a honeymoon period, but they have put a very aggressive timelines, which suggests that they understand, they've heard what a lot of independents are saying, that time is not on our side. We need very quick action on a lot of files that we've been saying for several years have effectively led to a broken regulatory market.
Yeah, no, I think that was a pervasive view, I think, amongst many, including, of course, the consumer side as well. So you talked about some of the various regulatory activities. Can you unpack a little bit what the CRTC is either planning or what it's conducting coming out of some of the kind of pronouncements that we've seen from the new chair?
So the big one that certainly is breaking news, so to speak, was just in the last few weeks, they announced a new proceeding, 2023-56, which really looks at the two major issues that I think service-based competitors have said. The one is that the rates do not seem to make sense. And again, it's important to understand the way that rates are set by the commission it's a cost-based approach. They look at the costs that the incumbent needs to has to provide that service, and then adds what we understand to be a fairly reasonable margin on that. They have agreed that there seems to be a problem with the current rate structure. They actually lowered preemptively what are called the usage sensitive. So that's the because our costs are broken into some fixed and usage ones. So the usage sensitive ones are as our customers use more data, we're charged more by the incumbents for that data. They lowered those 10% pretty much out of the gate, and have now started proceeding that we're going to see to review that. But the more encouraging development for sure is that they have agreed that the fiber regime is broken. We've been, like I said, as I said earlier, it's been since 2015 that the commission agreed that access to fiber was important, but we simply could not get a model that was cost effective. As an example, some of the costs that were being given to access services were sometimes 2 and 3 times what you'd see on the market if you went and bought from that competitor directly. Under what economic situation does that make sense? And there was also the technology by which we connect. And I won't get into the weeds on that, but they effectively said that fiber needs to be brought to competitors under the existing framework. They had many years ago developed a new technical framework, and it simply wasn't working. It was taking too long. It was very costly, and it simply wasn't producing any competition. The real sweetener on all this is they're doing this under an extremely expedited process, because of course, sometimes these proceedings can take years upon years. So we're very encouraged that they understand that this has to be done under a very, very tight timeline. That's certainly the big one that we're seeing, but in recent weeks they've started to look at the cost of roaming between mobile networks. They've also obviously are looking at the based on the minister's letter at the just roaming rates in general. There'll be we believe a review of the CRTC broadband fund, and one that's important to us is that the regulator is slated to investigate the rising cost of incumbent market power in the intercity transport segment. And transport's this buzzword that we use a lot, but in order for us to build our networks, you have to have the access to transport. You have to, all providers, even the incumbents, borrow facility and rent facilities from each other. But the access to that has just been dwindling, and certainly Rogers Shaw has now taken out another one of those players. So we're certainly encouraged. Always a bit worried because the CRTC does take along, like all the files I've just mentioned are of course just in the telecom side. The broadcast side has no lack, and of course they're going to be dealing with C11 and C18, which I know you're very familiar with. So one thing we just want to make sure that happens is that the commission has the resources it needs to take on what is a very aggressive agenda.
Okay, so it is an ambitious agenda, and as you kind of piece together the various elements that are in play, it's quite clear that it's got the chance to reshape what some of that regulatory environment looks like. So, why don't we conclude with this? It's clear there's a lot of upheaval going on right now. We've got the mergers that we were talking about at the big level with respect to Rogers Shaw. We've got the changes that are taking place within the independent sector, and now we've got a newly engaged CRTC that it appears is looking to turn the page on, well, frankly, the Ian Scott years with a somewhat different approach that I think many people are really happy to see. If we look ahead 5 or 10 years, even let's say 10 years, which is the timeline for these agreements that the minister is touting that he has with Rogers and Videotron, what do you think the Canadian market looks like Are we still struggling with some of the high prices and concerns about competition, or are you optimistic that the net effect of some of these things could result in some lasting change and a more competitive environment?
Um, it's a mixed bag. Certainly optimistic that the government and the CRTC has seen the value of service-based competition, and it's kind of a weird cycle. Like if you go back to even the Conservative era, they started with Bernier on a very pro-incumbent view, but eventually, when came quite around to service-based competition and did a lot of work there under Minister Clement, as you mentioned, and we kind of saw that under the current government. They kind of started a bit, I think, obviously we'd say on the wrong track, but have come around to see the value of competition. So my first hope is that this government clearly has seen the light, and any successive government we hope sees the same thing. But I do see a much different landscape. I think we're seeing some of the traditional, for lack of a better term, territories of the incumbents evaporating and them starting to play on a more national field. So I think consumers will benefit from that, but we'll also see some struggles on the independent. But I think we'll also see new competitors come out of that, and business models that we can't foresee. So I always like to be a bit optimistic. This has always been a very fast moving industry, and my hope is that Canadians benefit from that. The one challenge that I would urge the government and the CRTC to be careful is not to just always pick one horse. Like even as we look at the fourth national carrier, why not also do MVNO? If we look at even the fiber access, they chose to only pick one model many years ago. Don't always go on the one horse. I think there's room for facilities-based and service-based competition. And when both those models are embraced properly, that's when I think Canadians ultimately win with good competition and ultimately lower prices.
All right. So there is a path. Remains to be seen whether or not we get both the government, industry, and the regulator in alignment. But you've at least provided a more optimistic take on how there is still some hope for turning this thing around after a very long period of time, which I think has certainly frustrated some in the industry and most of all frustrated consumers. Paul, thank you so much for laying that all out and joining me on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
That's the Law Bites podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbites@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @LawBitesPod or Michael Geist @mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bites podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.